So I'd like to welcome and thank Viv Williams, who's Consulting Director at Symphony Legal, who will be responding to the, I won't say the grilling, but certainly the guidance and the questions from Olly Pughe, Financial Planner at Penguin Wealth. They're both highly experienced in working with law firms. I'm really glad that they've joined us today. They've got a viewpoint, particularly Viv, of legal practice across the UK, and particularly in areas that we're going to be discussing. So I'm really excited to share this knowledge with you, and I hope you enjoy. So I'm going to hand over to Olly, who'll lead the session, and yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, thanks very much for the introductions, Emma, and welcome everyone. So my role in the session is to pose questions and topics to the sage, that is Viv Williams. As per Emma's introduction, many of you may well know Viv is very experienced in terms of mergers and acquisitions and strategy, as well as providing general consulting to law firms in the UK. So today we'll be focusing on challenging facing law firms. You all know about that currently, and what actions can of course be taken. And as we all know, many of these challenges have been exacerbated by the onset of COVID. No surprises there. So to get things started, Viv, if you don't mind, just in general terms, can you tell us what impact lockdown has had on most law firms to date?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. It's been an interesting few months, to say the very least. I don't think any of us have experienced anything like this in our lifetimes. And I have to say that the differences between the well-managed firm who've coped with robust IT compared to the badly managed firm has been absolutely significant. And unfortunately, the legal sector hasn't been renowned for having the best run practices, particularly at the smaller end. So I've been receiving numerous phone calls from a variety of people who've been unable to get funding, who've had difficulty in finding ways to control cash, who found it very difficult to understand furloughing, because generally speaking, they are exceptionally good solicitors, but not exceptionally good business people. So what we can sort of strongly say is that the better run, well-managed firms have managed with the crisis early on and are coming through it now with people going back into work. But we've certainly seen a growth, I would say, in private client work, wills, lasting powers of attorney, trusts, and sadly probate. But all other departments have been very, very difficult to maintain and manage. So that's the overall view, I suspect. And coming out the other side is going to be very, very difficult. Okay, and
are there any sort of specific areas of laws that have been challenged more than others, Viv?
Legal aid in particular, I think criminal legal aid, family work has been quite buoyant. I touched on wills, probate, trust, etc. That's also been buoyant. Lots of PI firms who've had long books, for example, on clin neg and industrial disease work, they've been able to put their staff from home if they've got good, robust IT, and they've been able to continue working on files. So a lot of the PI firms have stayed very much stable. Conveyancing had fell off a cliff, although I have to say in the last couple of weeks, since the lockdown lifting measures, there's been lots and lots of inquiries for conveyancing work. So the market is certainly coming back. In what volume it's coming back, whether it's for remortgage work rather than new build, etc. Again, there's challenges there, we shall see.
Okay, so you mentioned, I'll come back to conveyancing if that's okay. So you mentioned then obviously about home-based working. So are you saying that firms have firms generally adapted technologically to that, or is that something they need to work on rapidly and for the future?
I think we're going to see a huge investment by most firms in technology going forward. I think the platforms that they've had, the practice management software they've had, if it's not cloud-based and not been able to work remotely, then they will have struggled to deal with this issue. The average in terms of furloughing for the medium to larger size firms is between 30 to 50% of staff, which is quite sizable when you look at it. One of my clients has 500 members of staff, and they've actually furloughed 50% of them.
Right. Okay.
So that puts it in perspective in terms of volumes.
Yeah, doesn't it just? And in terms of in terms of numbers and how furlough has affected things. Yeah, I made a few notes earlier, and it was, you were featured in a Law Society Gazette article just a few days ago, which highlighted that sector revenue was down 6.6% in the the first quarter of 2020 compared to 2019. So obviously that's just the start of what's going to be a very tough year for everybody, but particularly as much the legal sector as any. Have firms struggled to get the CBILS or the business interruption loan scheme? How have firms dealt with that?
Again, it depends on how well run the practice is and how well managed in terms of their facilities. For example, I've had regular weekly calls from one managing partner who has been denied CBILS loans because they were hitting their facilities every month. And the bank's view was, even if we give you this loan, they're still on the hook for 20%. So they're still of the view that they can't repay it after the 12-month holiday. And in fact, the same managing partner rang me last week and said that he'd been turned down for a bounce back loan. So it's just really understanding the better managed firms have obtained funding quite easily. And I think they're all relatively well managed, and they've made themselves financially quite stable through this process. But we know that in terms of turnover, we say the first quarter 6.6. Once lockdown started, most medium-sized, larger firms I'm talking to are anticipating a 40 to 50% reduction in turnover over the next 12 months.
Okay, that's pretty significant, isn't it? So, well, I suppose leading on from that, what changes are we seeing in terms of debtors and work in progress, timescales, what's going on with that, generally speaking?
Well, I think what's generally happened is that firms have had to take control over this where they hadn't done previously. As we know, there's a huge challenge in many law firms regarding the quantity of WIP that they carry and converting that into debtors and then not chasing the debt. So what we've seen with lots and lots of firms is they've grabbed hold of this and made some very vital decisions, i.e. agreeing new terms with their client base, payment up front or 7-day terms. They've chased their debtors down like they've never done before, and the work in progress has been reduced and billed. They've had to do it because cash is king. It's absolutely essential that we get control of the cash, because it's the banks that are now looking very carefully at this profession and where it goes.
Yeah, and are there other, in your understanding, is there other finance options available to firms? Obviously, apart from CBILS, how are banks viewing firms generally?
Well, I think the banks are obviously in a very difficult position. Prior to this, they were very cautious about lending, certainly in certain parts of the profession, personal injury work, clinical negligence. Some of the firms in that sector had been stretched to the limit in any event, and many of them have got funding through secondary lenders, but they're paying anywhere between 14 and 17% for that cash. So it's a very expensive money unless you know that work in progress is converting into decent profits. And I think what we've seen in terms of secondary lenders, they've been very nervous as well. I'm sure you've picked up in the last week, we've started to see some quite significant failures. Viv Williams is probably the biggest to date. They're a 30 million turnover law firm. But if you look at the finances of that business, they've been borrowing money left, right and centre and not making profits for several years. And it's quite interesting that I spoke at the Conveyancing Association conference at Celtic Manor in February, and their former managing partner was on the same panel as me, telling the audience how wonderful Viv Williams were, and yet they've now gone through a pre-pack. Obviously, he must have known there were financial issues. Okay,
there you go. I think we should just say at this point that there will be some positive news at some point, won't there? We're not going to be all doom and gloom.
Of course. I think we need to deal with what's been the urgent, and the urgent has been when most people have addressed their staffing levels, their financial levels, dealing with the WIP and the debtors, and getting their house in order. And yes, there have been some negatives in terms of obtaining the right levels of funding, etc. But I do think there's some very positives coming out of this.
Yeah, sure. Okay, we'll hopefully come on to that at some point. But so you mentioned that we're talking about a few minutes ago about technology. I just wanted to bring you back to the sort of the home working aspect of all this, which of course is covered all sectors, financial services, which I'm in. That's very topical for us as well. So, do you think that that's the future to some degree for law firms? Do you think firms will look to reduce the size of their offices? And on that topic, are there any tips that you've got right now for firms that need to deal with their landlords and other suppliers?
I think they'll have dealt with that already. But what I'm seeing though are firms saying we didn't trust our staff necessarily that they could work from home and would put the hours in. But that's changed. I have various law firms have said to me, we had 3 offices, we now have 1. We will never revert back to where we were because the overheads can be reduced on condition they can negotiate with landlords, etc. But I'm seeing a complete change in views regarding innovation. I do not think we will ever go back to the way we were. I think the profession has changed forever. And I know it's not the only profession that's changed, but I do think in terms of legal work, certainly lawyers and managing partners are now seeing that their staff can work successfully from home and put the time in and do it accordingly. Again, investment in robust IT systems is absolutely essential.
Yes, no, fair enough. Sorry, jumping topics a little bit. Back to the sort of liquidity and cash situation. Are there any other? Maybe it's an obvious question, but are there any other short-term things that firms can do to preserve cash at the moment?
Well, I think negotiating with suppliers for extending credit terms wherever possible. So most firms have discussed with their suppliers, whoever they are, whether it be utilities, stationery, whatever it might be, negotiating with them to extend terms. People have been very supportive because everyone's in the same boat. And I think by and large, negotiating that and coming through the other side with some more positive news. Most firms who are relatively well run have got bounce back loans. So it's giving them some headroom. But I have to say, I think, and again, unfortunately, on the side of gloom, that we have a large number of law firms that will not come through this for a variety of reasons. Some will be cash. Others will say, well, actually, do I really want to invest and start all over again? But I do think we will see significant failures over the next few months.
Okay. And you were just changing tack slightly. You had an article that you recently wrote called "What is the New Normality?" You mentioned conveyancing quite a bit, so just thought I'd cover that. And some really interesting stats there that you said that there's been a reduction of 700 firms offering conveyancing in the UK in the last 12 months alone. And the Land Registry says that there's 4,300 firms offering conveyancing, but with some predictions saying that it might go as low as 1,000 at some point in the future. So, what's your view on that in terms of? I know that we've had discussions in the past about offshoring. Perhaps you could just give us some suggestions and recommendations around that, Viv.
Well, this came out of the Conveyancing Association conference that I mentioned. It was interesting that it's basically conveyancing is a process. And what people are doing is using technology to drive change through their organizations. Many of the firms on the Land Registry are only doing perhaps 100 conveyancing matters a year. And what we're seeing, what we saw prior to lockdown, was the price pressure to do volume conveyancing work. That was driving the costs down. People just couldn't compete. So the view was we would see more and more firms dropping out of the market because they couldn't make it successful. What we're also seeing is firms saying, well, conveyancing is where the big challenges for PI comes from, for professional indemnity insurance, because that's where the risk and problems lie. So many firms are saying, well, actually, we may want to do conveyancing, but do we want to do it within our law firm? So we're seeing a move away for law firms to say, let's take a chunk of our conveyancing transactions and put them in a separate limited company that's regulated by the CLC, which is lighter touch regulation and cheaper PI, and doesn't impact on the firm doing and reducing their own PI through claims. I had a call this morning from a law firm, unfortunately, that has been doing lots of new build work, and they've been challenged to do with ground rents. So what we're starting to see is their PI premiums virtually doubling. And I was interviewing Howden earlier this week regarding what they were doing for a webinar, and they think there's a continuing hardening of the PI premiums, particularly for those firms doing property work. So I think there will be a move away to segregate out residential conveyancing into separate businesses and look at regulating that in a different way. And with regard to offshoring, a lot of firms now start to realise that the cost of running a conveyancing matter is quite prohibitive, and therefore to compete, particularly on the admin functions, so to do file openings, post-completion work, and to a degree some searches, that could be done in Bangalore. I have an interest in a business over there where the Indians don't have furloughing. They have, if you go into work as an Indian, they use a big stick to stop you, which is very different to what's happened in this country. But no, we're certainly seeing an offshoring growth in the admin functions of the conveyancing process, but no client contact.
Okay. And could that potentially apply to other areas of law in the future? I mean, conveyancing, I know that it's something you're heavily involved in. Is there other options? Is there other opportunities in the future?
Yes, certainly in the professional, in the personal injury market, certainly in probate, anything where there's a process involved. And what they do is they log into the law firm server. So they act as an employee, but they just happen to be 6,000 miles away. But they still log in. The cost saving after probably 3 months is a saving of anywhere between 40 and 50% on staff costs.
Yeah, I mean, just as an aside, we've used the services of using Indian services for some of our admin functions. It's been a success quicker than we thought it was, but that's just an aside. Okay, just changing tack again a little bit. New SRA rules came in November encouraging regulatory mapping. Can you dive into that for us, Viv, a little bit?
Yes, of course. I think it's interesting that the SRA's view is that a solicitor can now be regulated whilst working for a non-solicitor firm. So in other words, you could be employed as a solicitor working for an accounting firm, an IFA, an insurance company, and it's the individual that's regulated, not the business itself. Therefore, the cost of regulation for a solicitor's firm completely outweighs the balance between the way the SRA are going. Now, admittedly, these are doing non-reserved activities, but it still means that many solicitors will end up working for other businesses that are not SRA regulated. So my view was that how much of the work that a solicitor's practice actually does needs to be regulated. And when you look and delve into the amount of work that's done, generally speaking, I would say 66, 2/3 doesn't need to be regulated at all. So we can move that admin work and all the other functions into a separate limited company that doesn't need regulation by the SRA, but the cost, therefore, of the solicitor's firm PI and regulation costs is reduced significantly. So that's what I mean by regulatory mapping. Every firm's different. So we need to know what regulation is required on which departments, and those are the ones that the SRA would regulate. Everything else, separate limited company, therefore reducing the cost of compliance and regulations by as much as 2/3.
Well, that's very significant. And is that something you've handheld firms through Viv yourself? Is that something you've been involved in that process?
I don't do it personally, but I usually set up the theory of what's required and bring in a specialist compliance consultant to help with that. It needs to be carefully thought through, and each firm is different. So we can't actually relate it to taking the regulated part. It has to be done very carefully, and we need to understand what they're doing. So that's why I talk about the mapping process. We go through that as a process, present it back to the firm and say, we can set up a separate organization which can be providing you with these services as a service company. HR functions, all could be outside of the main solicitor regulated SRA body. And formally, then we can start looking at taking some other limited companies into separate units outside of the main business, still owned by the same owners, and that's what the SRA have encouraged.
Yeah, very interesting. That just again, changing tack as I'm doing a little bit here. You mentioned PI a little bit earlier. You know, any comments or thoughts or advice at the moment with legal aid and PI, just generally?
Legal aid, PI.
Legal aid and or PI at the moment.
Okay. I think legal aid and PI are the toughest of all at the moment. We're certainly seeing a tougher market. Now, I know we've seen the regulation change. Therefore, we've got a delay now because of the Civil Liabilities Act delay till next year. So that's not going to impact as we thought it would this year. But it still means that many PI firms have put themselves into virtual runoff. So they're not taking on new work. They're clearing out existing files and therefore paying down their bank debt. So I think PI is there. The challenge of criminal legal aid is the courts have been in turmoil and virtual. but also we're saying that the funding of them is very difficult as well. So there are a few consolidators out there. So I have 2 or 3 mergers that have been delayed, but I think will probably happen. I have a conveyancing transaction that should happen in June. This is a consolidator that's a bit like Rightmove and Zoopla. They've got private equity funding, but the difference is what they don't just want to put properties on there, they want to own the conveyancing firms. So they're in negotiation to buy 2 or 3 at the moment, conveyancing practices around the country, just to do the work for them in a process way. So there's some interesting stuff going on.
Very interesting, yeah. And you mentioned, I wanted to just bring you on to things that I know that we've discussed a few times in the past, Viv, sort of ownership structures or structures of the partnership model and succession. You know, have you had any observations about, you know, have partners been reducing distributions under the current situation? You know, have you seen much in terms of that?
I think the partners have all had to take a hit on their drawings, obviously. That's number one, and I think they should do. But I do think that the structures in terms of where the businesses are going, we're moving away from the traditional partnership, even LLP model, because there's still value in incorporation. Up until February, we were incorporating many law firms in a variety of different ways. But the value is that you can, whereas goodwill is hard to achieve when selling your practice to another law firm, if you've got younger staff coming through who want to be part of the future, they tend not to want to be equity partners. They tend to prefer to be maybe directors of a limited company. So by incorporating, the good thing about that is that HMRC do not perceive that goodwill is a problem. So what HMRC will accept is a goodwill valuation before drawings of anywhere between 4 and 6 times profitability. So I converted a litigation practice in London in February, where father, who's 72, has 2 of his children working in the firm. He's gifted them £1 million each on a 3.5 million turnover. HMRC have accepted a valuation for that practice of £4 million. So now he's bringing in younger people to become directors of a limited company who didn't want to join him as equity members of a partnership. And I think that's a big move to think about when we think about strategy going forward. I think understanding about the regulatory mapping is one thing, but taking advantage of incorporation, even an LLP can take advantage of this. And there's significant, and it's not real money, of course, because in essence, what happens is that you're creating goodwill on the balance sheet, which is converted to a director's loan account, which is fine, and you can draw down that money without paying any tax. The only downside is capital gains tax, and that can be deferred for up to 8 years, but that's only 20%. So 20%, if you get a valuation of 4 million, things a big difference in terms of what's going on.
Yes, and just from my experience with that, you know, the tax advantages are not to be sniffed at, and also, you know, in my dealings with sort of perhaps some of the younger rising solicitors, yeah, what you said there is the appetite, I think, to take on the risk within a partnership, and it just because of the nature of the world that we live in now, and the fact how things move so quickly. The last 3 months is a good example. Yeah. I think that just the appetite's not there anymore. So from a succession point of view, it really has to be looked at for those firms that are still partnerships or LLPs. So, but I did read, actually, I don't know whether you're, I think this is true, but that I think over 60% of law firms have incorporated. So there's been, you know, quite a big turn, you know, become limited companies. So there's been quite a big shift in the last 10 or 12 years in that direction, as far as I can see.
Yeah. When you think in 2007, we were 100% partnerships, and that's when the SRA was formed, and now we are 68% limited companies. That's a little bit distorted because of the new models where you end up with a bit like carbon law was, and or Setfords and or Nexa. These are individuals working within a limited company model underneath an umbrella of someone providing them with PI cover and some admin support.
Yeah, do you think, that's actually one of my questions that I was going to ask you is, you know, what do you see the future of those chambers style models? You know, obviously, as you said, we're very familiar with carbon law in South Wales. You know, how do you see the future of this sort of structure? It's
the old fashioned network that used to be in financial services some years ago. It's very
True, yeah.
similar in terms of structure, and I can see it growing, to be honest, because I think with the trend at the moment is if we are, and if you believe the Gazettes, they're talking about 60 to 70% of the high street disappearing. I don't believe that. I do feel, though, there will be some challenges ahead, and there will be people, solicitors working within those firms that will want to go in their own route, and that will probably be working in an eat what you kill type policy on a anywhere between 60-40 or 25-75 split between the person running the admin and the person actually doing the work. But it will be eat what you kill. So unless you've got a following, you have to go out and find that work yourself. But working as a sole trader in a high street, it's going to be very tough to see the future for that, I think.
And just another question on structures, if you like. We're seeing the rise of the professional CEO. Have you seen much? Have you got much experience of that, Viv? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a growing trend towards non-lawyers running law firms. I myself act as non-exec director in several law firms. I'm non-exec chairman of 2. I've just converted 2 of my non-exec roles to virtual non-exec roles. So we have Zoom meetings like this every week or so to discuss the challenges they're facing and how we can deal with it. And it's having that external knowledge that can bring in a non-legal view of running a practice. And these applies both in small and large. I've got a 800,000 turnover law firm that I'm acting for who want to change their structure and what they do, obviously facing the challenge they've got. So it doesn't have to be big firms. And of course, when you're doing them virtually, because there's no travel cost involved, it's a lot cheaper. It just adds a different perspective about what they can do and about where they can go over the next 6 months, 12 months as we drive our way through this pandemic. Okay,
yeah, no, fair comment. I couldn't not mention sort of mergers and acquisitions, Viv, something probably quite dear to your heart. Is there still interest currently? Is there interest out there, and how could that work, practically at the moment, in the current situation?
Obviously, most of the ones I had going on have dried up completely or have just been put on hold. We do have, as I mentioned, this conveyancing activity. It's all done by Zoom meetings. The due diligence has been done by exchange of emails with bank details, files, etc. And I suspect that deal will happen this month. So there's still some activity going on, and we do have interest. We saw that Taylor Rose acquired Viv Williams even through the lockdown. So these things are happening. I think there will be lots and lots of merger activity happening over the next few months. I suspect we have an equal amount of buyers as we have sellers. So I'm encouraging those firms that are looking to grow in the right way by doing their due diligence correctly. I think many of them will go through an insolvency process. So they'll go into a pre-pack and come out the other side without the responsibility of carrying all the valuations. I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying it's become norm for many firms to do that over the past year or 2, and I think will continue.
Okay, very interesting. Thanks. I've just got some general questions, and I'll start coming towards the end of my questions because I know Emma's got a few possibly, and maybe some from the participants, the audience. So, disaster recovery policies. As a general question, what have you observed with regard to firms and these, Viv, and how that's played out?
Quite a few of them have not coughed up yet. So there's a number that were still waiting for a variety of things. They're trying always to see whether pandemics are excluded from the policy. So I've had quite a few law firms asking me, do I know anything about it? And I've questioned the insurers about it. In some cases, I haven't heard of any substantial payouts.
Okay. And complaint, from a point of view of complaints, what do you think in terms of complaint numbers going forward? What do you think we're likely to see?
I think the insurers are expecting quite a significant rise in complaints. People working from home may not have the supervision they've traditionally had. So I think what we'll end up seeing, again, it depends on how strong the management has been and how robust the terms of the technology. Because if you're working on a server from home and doing the job properly, then there shouldn't really be that much of a challenge. But I think the insurance industry is expecting quite a significant rise in complaints, and I suspect we probably will see a rise in those. and we'll see another hardening of the PI market.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. And yeah, do you have any top tips, Viv, for firms to remain compliant in the current situation?
I think, again, it's back down to technology. If you've got people coming back in the office, as I know some people have this week, between 25 and 50% of staff are coming in with social distancing being put in place. So the 2 meter apart, the walking up and down, not using kitchens. It means you can't go back to the way things were. So I think there is a big change in the way that people are operating. And those people working from home, we have to have agile working. We have to continue to go towards agile working. And what I'm seeing is in the bigger firms, they're saying we need to be more innovative. How can we come up with new ideas of delivering services away from the traditional, come into the office for a meeting, let's gather all your information. And I think Zoom has been a revelation. I mean, most lawyers now thought Zoom was an ice lolly from the 1980s, but now it's actually a technology that we're all used to. So we're using meeting rooms, we're using Skype, we're using Zoom, and meetings with clients can be done this way without the cost of travel. And I think if people can work from home, agile working and be more innovative is part of the future. People don't want to go back to the way we were. I think commuting in an hour into a city centre could well be for a few rather than for the majority. So I do think that's going to be a big change in the way we work.
Yeah, there's of course potential significant cost savings, as you were talking about earlier. You know, there's a lot of benefits to that in any business, any sector. Okay, so just one important question for me to ask you, Viv, before a few more questions before I hand over to Emma, is: are there any positives to come out of the current crisis? Any positives that you can highlight for people?
Well, I sit in every fortnight in a group of 100 lawyers, and I sit in their meetings to discuss how the challenges they're facing and what they do. And we had a meeting yesterday, and it's interesting how people have embraced some of these challenges and said, we should have invested heavily in IT. One particular firm they outsource their IT to someone else. So they've been able to switch very quickly to home working and doing it very successfully. And they've all said the cost saving and the way we deliver, and what they don't want to do is to drift back into the way that we were. So most firms have said, we had a crisis when the lockdown started. So we've dealt with the key issues of stopping all the challenges, dealing with the staff. But part of the question is, if you furloughed half your staff, how do you keep them on board? So you have to have regular meetings with them, whether you furloughed 10 people or 250 people. And you have to realize that they will feel, why have they been furloughed and other people are still working? So I think there's big issues regarding staff and making sure your staff are coming back, because I think there will be quite a bounce back. I think we've already seen it in the property sector. And I suspect it's this more agile thought process. Certainly people have said, we've got an employment package, for example, why don't you pay us a monthly fee and we'll do all your employment work up front. So they're receiving a 12-month fee, but they're actually doing the work now. So it's just changing the way we engage with clients much more regularly. And I think the will market will, as you know, has increased dramatically because of this.
No, that's very true. Yeah, no, that's true. Okay, so to sort of take a couple more questions, bringing things to a close from me. It's an impossible question, Viv, but if you have to narrow it down, what are the 2 or 3 most important things that you think, or in your opinion, that a law firm should be considering or could do right now in the current situation?
I think part of the strategy is to think very carefully about what your business looks like, what structure it is, and where you can take that firm. I think we will see people taking advantage of, there will be redundancies. I mean, I know that's a sad part, and that's not just going to be staff, fee earners and support staff. I suspect we'll see reduction in partners as well. We're already hearing noises from larger firms who are saying, actually, this partner was underperforming in any event, so maybe this is a good opportunity to make them redundant. So I think we'll start to see the way that the business is modelled. What can we do differently? How can we do it in such a way that we can get the best value out of our structure? And how can we create that strategy for each department So, and all this can be done remotely by Zoom, but it's really understanding what that strategy could be. Because I think I've been talking about lean management for many years. I suspect most firms will have to now say, well, how can we deal with what we've got and how can we change it to make it more profitable? And the other thing, and I know you're going to love me for saying this, I think most law firms who have a private client part of their business should really consider the financial services aspects, the important part of what they do. I've been advocating this for a long time. We only have 30 odd firms now that are jointly regulated by the SRA and the FCA. We used to have 400. But I think the growth of financial services alongside the legal profession, particularly in private client work, will be much more significant in the future. We've seen IFAs acquiring law firms. So we know of several of them that have gone into that route of acquisition. And I wouldn't be surprised to see more IFAs buying up will banks, employing solicitors to grow the private part of the business. So I think that's going to be quite significant.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with what you said there. You know, and yeah, I concur with that very much. Yeah, and well, I've just got one final question, and I'll hand over to Emma, as she's going to field the questions for everybody. But and I know you'd be upset with me, Viv, if I didn't ask you this. You know, is there anything that you personally can do right now to help firms in the current situation?
Well, all I can do is give advice and guidance, and I'm more than willing to talk to anyone privately, either on my mobile or by email, and give them some advice and guidance completely free of charge so that they can get a feel for what they can and cannot do with what they've got. I think under the circumstances, that's probably the best I can do. But I think going forward, there's the opportunity to change more than we've ever thought we could. And I think the exciting part is to be innovative and to say, what can we do to change the way we do things now? What structure do we need? The people we need? How do we deliver the work we can do? And I think there's quite a few significant changes that will come out of this. But technology will be certainly one. And I'm willing to help, and by all means, my contact details are there at the end, so I'm more than happy to share my time.
Very good. Well, that's thanks very much for that, Viv, and that concludes my questions. I hope that wasn't too much of a grilling. I don't think it was. But maybe I could hand back over to you, Emma, if that's okay, and you could perhaps pick up on the questions that people might have been asking.
Absolutely. Thank you both very much. Just a quick response to some of the things that Viv's been saying. It's fantastic that I feel like we're on the same track here, because so the last couple of events we've been running, firstly on business interruption insurance, I'll make sure I send everybody the link to that, which we held in the last couple of weeks. So some of the pointers there with the chambers. We recently held an event covering compliance and supervision. So, you know, potentially the long-term impact on well-being, on staff, and issues with quality of work that could arise, but also managing how to manage supervision while remote working. And I think if we do go forwards into more agile working, as we've already seen with the likes of Slater and Gordon announcing that they will be shifting towards a more modern workplace environments, and also because it offers more opportunities for attracting talent, then we need to really make sure that supervision and also employees' well-being is managed on a remote basis, because it's very hard to tell if someone is coping or not. And again, we've got an event coming up with DAC Beechcroft and Howden within the fortnight to address PII, professional indemnity insurance. And we've got an event with the LMS on reintegrating staff and the return to work, which will cover things like reintegrating furloughed staff. So obviously you'll all get information about that. So we're covering the same topics. I think that's fantastic. There has been a comment made which I'd like to share. So as we know, the current climate has led to thoughts about potentially merging with other firms. I think we were seeing this quite heavily over the last year anyway, but it's perhaps going to increase. Is there a typical process, Viv, that is or should be followed, including how approaches are made or should be made, and how the process could be coordinated with or without third-party assistance, especially for the smaller firms? So it's that kind of difficult situation you might find yourself in, and should we approach them? How do we go through that process? I don't know if you had a brief response to that.
Yeah, I personally would not make any approaches. Now, you'd say, I'm bound to say that, aren't I? The question is that once you go and approach someone as a seller, people think you're actually in distress. So automatically, the view of the buyer is that you're in distress, therefore any valuation they might wish to pay for you will go down. And on the converse side, as a potential buyer, you approach a firm, they think their Christmas has come early, so therefore they think their valuation is much higher. So I would always recommend using a third party. Quite often this can be done on a success-only basis, but it means there's anonymity in there so that no one knows exactly who you are, whether you're buyer or seller. I think one of the challenges for smaller firms is the successor practice issue. So what we're seeing is a number of firms is where the actual acquirer doesn't want to become a successor practice. So you're either faced with selling a business which, quite frankly, is not worth a great deal. I had a call yesterday from a sole practitioner, and when I asked him his turnover, he said it's £110,000. And he's had some claims. So I'm thinking, who on earth is going to become a successor practice to that business? So in some cases, the only way to acquire some of the smaller firms is to acquire the will bank. And that will bank has a value which can be used as an annuity over a period of time. And I've seen some firms generating 20% of income going forward, but it still means we have the challenge of dealing with the firm itself. So I'm more than happy to have those conversations, but I will be honest and frank. If I don't think we can get any value for the firm, I will say so.
Thank you, Viv. Just before I hand over to see, because obviously I don't want to take the participants' time up because they'll have many questions. We have seen in Wales that the Economic Resilience Fund the phase 1 has gone out to many businesses in all sectors. And there has been an announcement, which I know the Law Society Wales and I will be sharing more details on in terms of the next wave. A lot of the challenges that law firms have been facing is that obviously when lockdown hit, they were scrabbling to bill. And so they couldn't show a 40% drop in income to qualify for the resilience fund. We're hoping that now there may be, well, you tell me, do you think we're in a position now where they're in a period that they could show something of that kind of loss?
I would have thought so. I'd have thought we've seen over the past 12 weeks or so that despite the challenge of bringing the work in through WIP and invoicing through debtors, I still think we will see significant losses that should demonstrate that type of volume of loss, yes.
Thank you. And obviously you touched on the conveyancing market earlier, which has opened up in England, but not quite yet in Wales, no, unfortunately. So it'd be interesting to, I know we'll touch base again to perhaps get some feedback on how things are going in England, because that may well shine a light on progress here in Wales, which we seem to be about 3 to 4 weeks behind, although we do obviously have an announcement coming on the 18th of June. I'd like to open up to the floor to see if anyone has any, or virtual floor, to see if anyone has any questions or comments that they'd like to share. If you can't unmute yourself, wave your hand and I'll help you. All quiet. I have got some other questions, if it's not a problem. So while you're thinking, the crisis management has come up time and time again in terms of, have firms got a plan? Obviously nobody could have planned for a pandemic, and certainly not the intensity to which we face at the moment. Are the firms that you're speaking to now starting to integrate a crisis management plan, even if it's a rolling one, so looking at a potential second lockdown? And is this something that you definitely advise focusing on, although I appreciate people have got other things to do at present?
Yes, definitely. I think you have to be prepared that we could see a second spike. Interestingly enough, on one of these phone calls with the large and mid-sized firms, they were saying that they'd recently finished their 5-year strategic plan. And by the time the lockdown arrived, they threw it out of the window and said, we've now got a 5-week rolling plan, because that's all you can predict for under the present circumstances. So it's dealing with the cash issues, dealing where you can with new work, etc., billing it and getting the cash in. But having a crisis plan for a second spike, I think, is essential, because we could well see that. And certainly from England, I think we will see more challenges in some of the bigger cities than we are doing in Wales at the moment.
Thank you. I've just had a question through the chat. Should firms need to look at pay structures to reflect what the new normal will be? That's a really interesting one.
It is. It's quite interesting that some of the firms who have furloughed staff have asked their existing staff who are still working to take a 20% reduction in salary. And in most cases, the staff have accepted that. Because furlough is only 80% of their salary up to 2,500, they've accepted a 20% reduction even though they're working. Now, I think we are seeing, with remote access and more agile working, a reduction in salaries and much more, I think, bonus-led payments. So that's starting to change.
Yeah, we've also seen, so we have a recruitment section on the site that many people will have seen, which I have to say is also open to employers, although we can't work with any other recruitment agencies. And the number of home working opportunities that have been posted on there have obviously increased. But interestingly, some of the roles are based in England, but there is an idea that person could continue to homework. So, you know, the opportunities for practitioners both in Wales and in England, you know, almost overnight have completely changed. Now, whether that's reflected in pay or not, I'm not too sure at present, but I will find out for sure. Has anybody else got any questions while I've been talking, or anything they'd like to ask Viv and Olly? I think we've covered quite a lot, to be fair, Viv. I've covered movements in the market, cash flow, crisis management, the tech debate. There's a lot of move on obviously the technology that exists at the moment. So the 365 suites, cloud-based software. We know that firms have already got to grips with that. They now need to explore perhaps the potential benefits underneath that. Huge amounts of money being saved by switching to that over servers, which is a great immediate move for firms. There's also the rise, obviously, of the tech law, the law tech debate that's going through at the moment, certainly on our platform. I know the Law Society Wales office is in conversation to try and move that along for Wales and create a little bit more of a focus to help firms, which is, you know, a really positive move out of a very very disruptive time and challenging times that we have at the moment. So I think there's more on that to come. I know Richard Jones from the Law Society Wales office is on the call as well. Hi. So Olly, I didn't know if you had anything that you'd like to say to close the event, because I appreciate we're close to time.
No, I was going to let you do that, Emma.
Okay, that's fine. I'd like to thank both our speakers, Viv Williams and Olly Pughe from Penguin, for their time, their support, and all the work they've put into today. All the video from today will be shared with you, and I'll also share their contact details. So if there's anything offline you'd like to talk to them about in confidence, you're very welcome to. Obviously, you can share this with any colleagues, and please keep an eye on the events listings for the next couple of weeks, because they talk about exactly the things we've been raising today, and obviously the past recordings on our feature pages. Have a lovely weekend. Thank you again, and I hope to see you soon.